to better understand the function of Earth and how energy flows through Earth and how matter is recycled on Earth, we break down the study or the science of Earth into a couple of different spheres. So these spheres are the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, the biosphere, the lithosphere, and the magnetosphere. So I'll just quickly go through each one and some of the distinguishing properties of each one. So if we look at the atmosphere first, that's the layer of gases that surround our Earth, and it's being held in to around Earth by the power of gravity. And what gravity does is it makes those gases more dense or thicker close to the surface of Earth. So 70% of all the gases that are in our atmosphere are found in the first kilometres as we go up into our atmosphere. And most of our atmosphere is nitrogen, so 70% of the atmosphere is nitrogen and 20% is oxygen, and then you get small amounts of carbon dioxide as the next one, and then a small amount of other gases too. Some of the interesting things about the atmospheres is one being the oxygen that's there, because that doesn't naturally occur within our atmosphere. It was actually put into the atmosphere by photosynthetic bacteria and later by plants. So the presence of oxygen in our atmosphere is a way that life on Earth has actually transformed the atmosphere, and by doing that has enabled more complex life forms to evolve on Earth. Because if it wasn't for oxygen and being in the atmosphere, we couldn't respire, which means breaking down our food to release energy. And to break down our food and release energy, we need oxygen. So all plants and all animals need to respire to be able to create energy. And the only things that could first do that without needing oxygen were anaerobic bacteria, and they were the ones that first developed the ability to photosynthesize and put all the oxygen in our atmosphere. And then plants and animals evolved later, and their evolution was dependent upon that oxygen being in the atmosphere. So immediately you're kind of seeing these connections between these different spheres. So the atmosphere and the biosphere are linked together by the function of the biosphere, by putting the oxygen into the atmosphere. The next one is the hydrosphere. So the hydrosphere describes all the water on Earth. So most of it's in the ocean, but then you get various amounts of fresh water. So I think it's about 70% of all water on Earth is in the oceans. And then of the remaining water, most of that is locked up in ice in the north and south poles. And a big proportion of the remainder of the fresh water is stored as groundwater, where it's also quite inaccessible or easily accessible for us to use as a supply of fresh water. The rest of the fresh water is in lakes and rivers, wetlands and streams and swamps and all those various aquatic freshwater habitats. Again, there's a movement of energy and matter from the hydrosphere into the other spheres. So as water is evaporated off by the sun, it enters into the atmosphere. As water cools in the atmosphere, it falls down as rain, and then as it rains down the mountains and the slopes, it erodes away the land and deposits those sediments into the streams, rivers and oceans, and the minerals and the nutrients that are in those sediments help support the aquatic systems in those freshwater and marine habitats. So there's this whole linking between the recycling of matter and flowing of energy between these systems. The biosphere is the next one. So the biosphere is all the living things on Earth, so all the animals, all the plants, all the fungi, all the bacteria. They all work together in ecosystems, so there's feeding relationships and who eats who within an ecosystem, but they also help moderate the other spheres as well. So we saw an example of how they modified the atmosphere by putting oxygen into it, but as far as the hydrosphere goes as well, plants can transpire, which means they lose water from their leaves, and by doing that they create a lot of water humidity in the air and can dramatically impact the rainfall of an environment. So if you look at a tropical rainforest, for example, 3/4 of all the rain that's in that rainforest is actually put into the atmosphere by the trees. And in more fragile environments, particularly areas that are close to the equator where the temperatures can be a bit more extreme, if you remove the trees, like we have done in a lot of the areas in the Middle East and Mediterranean and Northern Africa, we remove the ability for that atmosphere to be humidified by the trees. And there's less water in the atmosphere, therefore, and it becomes even more drier and more extreme, and those areas become deserts. So you can see how the biosphere affects the hydrosphere as well as the atmosphere. The other one is the lithosphere. So the lithosphere is all the solid earth and rock that's on Earth. If you cut through Earth like a knife, you can actually see the different layers of Earth. So you can see the inner core that's molten iron, and then the outer core that's semi-molten rocks and metals, and then the mantle, which is kind of a slowly tuning semi-molten rock, and then the core, which is the solid part of the Earth that we stand upon. And the soils as well. The soils have got a lot of sediments from those rocks as the foundation of those soil. So again, as volcanoes erupt, they can affect the temperature of the atmosphere. They can affect the gases that are in the atmosphere. They can change the temperatures of the water that's in the oceans. And as they erode, they provide a habitat in the soil that supports the soil food web, and that soil food web then recycles all the nutrients that are in an ecosystem and supplies those nutrients for plants so that they can then feed a whole ecosystem by eating those plants. And the last one is the magnetosphere. So the magnetosphere is a magnetic field that surrounds the Earth, and it's created by the center of the Earth having a molten core, and that molten core generates that magnetic field. And if it wasn't for that magnetic field, there's a lot of solar radiation. So radiation is harmful to living things. It will, if we were standing outside and we were radiated by the sun, we'd be burnt to a crisp. But the magnetic field that surrounds Earth deflects most of that harmful radiation away from Earth and allows gentle kind of beneficial conditions to support life on Earth. So it wouldn't be possible for all the diverse life on Earth to be here without the protection of the magnetosphere. So we kind of trying to understand the function of Earth and how energy is moving through it and how matter is being recycled on Earth, we kind of refer to these terms. So we refer to the atmosphere, hydrosphere, biosphere, lithosphere and magnetosphere as a way of kind of just on a big picture term understanding the function of how Earth works.